Look, it's easy to be pretty negative about what happened at the White House, but I would say there are some silver linings for Ukraine and for Europe. Firstly, I think the ambush, there's nothing else to describe it, by J.D. Vance and Trump of Zelensky, I think laid it out crystal clear that the US, and Trump himself said it, he trusts Putin, he doesn't trust Zelensky. So I think it's clear to the Ukrainians and Europe where the US stands. I think also, and it forced, I guess, the UK back into Europe, right? I mean, Starmer Chalmer did a superb performance, in my mind, over the weekend, bringing people together, calming the White House down a bit, bringing Europeans together. And it's now clear, actually, that Europe and Ukraine have to be involved in the peace process. I mean, one of the problems for the Ukrainians, actually, has been in recent weeks, that whole peace process has been taken away from them. It's been a US, Russia-centered process where their story's not been really part of the process. Now, the US will take a back seat. The UK, with Italy and I think France, are centre stage. And more of what Ukraine wants will be in any peace process that, in my mind, makes it more sustainable. I think the problem with the imposed ceasefire that was likely from a Trump administration with the Russians is that in no way would that have been sustainable, right? I mean, the Russians were getting everything that they wanted. It was very hard for the Ukrainians to sell that at home. And without security guarantees of any sort, and given Putin's track record, I think the assumption would have been that Russia would have invaded again. There would have been no investment. The country would have not been sustainable. We'd have had very difficult presidential elections with demobilization, all that kind of thing. So I think now we have the prospects of a peace process that actually could be sustainable.
Okay, I think that's interesting that you think that Europe has now, muscled its way into that seat at the table of for negotiations, rather than it just being US and Russia. How committed do you think Europe is to increase defence spending? How real is that? Who and how is it paid for? Because Macron's talking about an increase to 3 to 3.5% of defence spending as a share of GDP. The EU providing €200 billion in terms of a boost to defence spending. How much commitment is there, and how does it get paid for?
Look, it should be crystal clear to European leaders now that NATO is dead. We can't rely on the US security guarantee. They've kind of spelt it out to us. I mean, J.D. Vance talking about interests and values not being aligned. We just have to get on with our defence. And Russia is an existential threat. It's absolutely crystal clear. I mean, Russia has used weapons of mass destruction twice on NATO member soil in Europe against the UK, Skripal and Litvinenko, right? We didn't do anything about it. They continue to engage in malign activities against us. I think European politicians get it. The financing I'm not really worried about, actually. I mean, Europe is a 27 trillion euro economy. Europe is 2 trillion. When Europe faces enormous threats like COVID, we get our act together. I don't think it's beyond our kind of abilities to put together a 500 billion finance package. And remember also, we still have $330 billion of Central Bank of Russian taxpayer assets in cash in our bank accounts that our governments have done nothing about. They've sat on their backsides and not utilised that money. 330 billion. Okay. Remember, UK, for example, last week, we increased our defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. Funded by drawing down the soft diplomacy aid budget. Imagine we have £25 billion of Russian money in our bank accounts. We should and could have used that money to provide a quick solution to our own defence spending needs without attacking the aid budget. We've just done nothing about it.
So if the money is the easy bit, then what about the hard bit, and the possibility of extricating Europe from the deep ties that Europe has in its defence support? Think Starlink, think all of the operational capability that the US has. Do you really think that the UK is going to do that, to try to separate its defence and military capabilities from those of the US?
Look, Europe's problem is not finance, it's just military tech. It's producing the high-tech kit that we just don't do, and we've overly integrated into US systems. Now, extricating ourselves from that will be painful, but we have to do it. It's in our own national interest.
Do you think leaders are really contemplating along those
They
lines?
have to be. If they have no
It didn't seem to
clues
be a
about
hint
national
from
security.
Keir Starmer of that.
I think behind the scenes, I mean, Keir Starmer, I thought, did an excellent job over the weekend. I mean, in a really difficult situation, reaching out to the White House, bringing European countries together, the 4-point peace plan that he's put together, I think is quite credible. This idea of a truce is quite interesting. Look, when you talk to people behind the scenes, and I do a lot, they get it. They absolutely get it. But we're in this really tricky situation. Now, we have leverage, which is interesting, and Europe needs to figure out how we do that, right? Our short-term problem, obviously, is military production. We have to rely on the Americans, right? We have the cash. What we should be doing is pitching to the Americans and saying, look, Trump likes big shiny deals. We should go to the Yanks and we should say, look, we want to commit over a 10-year period to buy between $500 billion and $1 trillion of kit from you guys. Trump likes jobs, jobs, jobs. He would not say no to that. So, and over the longer term, obviously there's this China threat to the Americans. Perhaps that's why they seem to be getting friendly with the Russians. If the long-term battle for the Americans, the hegemonic battle, is with China, Europe, a $27 trillion economy, should be much more useful to the Americans than the Russian $2 trillion economy. If we will get our military-industrial complex up and running on a 5-year period, and then we're useful for the Americans. We can provide the Americans with the military-industrial scale to outgun the Chinese ultimately. So this is the pitch. Short-term, weapons procurement for the Americans. Long-term, we can help the Americans in their long-term hegemonic battle with Chinese. In the end, if we don't do that, then we need to look for other options, which is actually improving relations with China and reaching out to countries like Turkey and the Gulf states that could help us in terms of diversifying our financing and our security kind of offering.
Yeah, I saw, I think it was on social media, that you put the idea of bringing Turkey sort of closer into the fold, making it part of the European Union. I mean, that's kind of been long stalled sort of negotiations in the background. Why? Tell us why.
Well, I didn't say that. I've been a strong supporter historically of EU accession for Turkey, but the reality is it's kind of going nowhere.
Yeah.
The Turks get that, right? But the Turks want deeper economic ties. They want a new customs union. In military technology, they've made huge strides in recent years. Their Bayraktar drones are world-beating, right? They can provide something to us. They've recently, the Turks themselves, been buying military companies in Europe, right? So Turkey can give us it has a large military-industrial complex. It's got 800,000 soldiers. The one country, actually, that could put troops on the ground in scale in Ukraine as a peacekeeping force is Turkey. So it's really important that they were at the Lancaster House discussions over the weekend. They offer us scale in terms of military-industrial production. They want technology transfer, right? They've been talking for years at working with UK companies, Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace. We haven't done enough, frankly, as in the UK, to bring Turkey in and improve our cooperation.
When you think about that military technology and drones, I know you're also quite focused on that, drones. Bloomberg, a few months ago, did a kind of side-by-side comparison of all the different kit that Europe had versus the United States, which I thought was very interesting. Do you include nuclear in that? Because the nuclear deterrent now is also surely very fundamental. If you look at a map of Europe, Russia one side, then there's a great big gap, and then there's the nuclear deterrent, in the West, in France and the UK.
Well, it gives the UK and France leverage. The French have obviously been suggesting they could extend that over NATO partners. I mean, there are vulnerabilities in our nuclear capability. I mean, we are reliant on Tomahawk missiles ourselves, and when we come to upgrade, or we are upgrading our nuclear capability, I mean, again, we rely heavily on US technology. We need to think again, longer term, how we diversify potentially other sources around that. It's our reliance now on the US is a vulnerability, clearly.
I think, which in and of itself is a kind of 1 week realization in Europe, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, there was always going to be an election in the US. It was a tight contest. It was a 50-50 call. It was possible that Trump was going to win. We knew all about Trump in the first term, and they'd been messaging around this. Unfortunately, I think we had our heads in the sand, and we didn't realise the world was changing. The world has now changed. Post Friday's showdown in the White House, it should be crystal clear, I think, to everyone where Trump's sympathies lay, and they're not with Europe.
Elon Musk talking over the weekend, posting online that the US should leave NATO and the UN. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, as I said, NATO is more or less dead already. It was interesting, actually, listen to Trump, and he was asked about the US security backstop for Poland, and he was very strong around it. And then when it came to the Baltic states, he was less strong about it. So, in the end, NATO's Article 5 should extend to all members, even raising a few doubts about whether the Americans would stand behind some NATO states, I think says it all. Right, we just cannot rely on the Americans anymore. We have to move on. We have to think about our own national interests, our own security. We have this very difficult transition period. We need to get through that. We need to be clever. We need to realize that we do have leverage over the Americans as well. We need to use that leverage as far as we can. The positive is we have cash. We actually have a big economy, big strong economy. We can fund this.